Well, ABC News is coming under intense criticism for its handling of Wednesday night's Democratic debate in Pennsylvania. It was the last before next week's primary. During the first 45 minutes of the debate, the moderators, Charles Gibson and George Stephanopoulos, focused on Obama's comments that some voters in Pennsylvania were bitter. The Reverend Jeremiah Wright controversy, Clinton's Bosnia sniper fire story, flag pin, and the weather underground. The primetime debate was seen by 10.7 million people, according to Nielsen Media Research. That's the most of any debate this election cycle. According to the Associated Press, nearly 17,000 comments were posted on ABC News' website by Thursday evening. The tone overwhelmingly negative. Tom Shales of the Washington Post said Gibson and Stephanopoulos, quote, turned in shoddy, despicable performances. The media critic, Greg Mitchell, said it was, quote, perhaps the most embarrassing performance by the media in a major presidential debate in years. Salon.com said, quote, I'm not sure if we've seen anything quite as train wreck, cover your eyes, bad as the spectacle on ABC last night. Will Bunch, a Philadelphia Daily News writer, posted an open letter to Gibson and Stephanopoulos on his blog, telling them, quote, you disgrace the American voters and, in fact, even disgrace democracy itself. And the group Move On said it would air an ad protesting ABC if 100,000 people sign their petition. Glenn Greenwald is a former constitutional law attorney, now a contributing writer at Salon.com. He's the author of a number of books. His latest is called Great American Hypocrites. We welcome you to Democracy Now!, Glenn Greenwald.
Great to be back. Thanks, Amy.
You've been blogging a great deal about this debate. Can you talk about what happened on Wednesday night in Pennsylvania?
Well, in one sense, it was an extreme and rather transparent act of journalistic malfeasance. I mean, that's just obvious. Take a look at just some of the stories that you reported on in the prior segment, virtually all of which were completely absent from the debate. Instead, the first half of the debate focused almost exclusively on the type of petty, insipid, personality-based attacks that dominate our political discourse and determine our national elections. But in another sense, I think it's important to note that this debate is not in any way aberrational. I mean, in heaping all this scorn on what George Stephanopoulos and Charlie Gibson have done, I think it's important to acknowledge the fact that really all they're doing is what is done continuously throughout our election cycles for decades now. This was sort of a more transparent act because all of these vapid questions were bunched together at the beginning. But it's worth recalling that over the past couple of weeks, the news cycle was dominated by the scandal that Barack Obama wants to be president of the United States, even though he doesn't bowl very well, which was followed by the comments that he made in San Francisco, what Maureen Dowd in the New York Times called the capital of elitism, and prior to that there was the lapel pin controversy, the never-ending fixation on Jeremiah Wright's video, the comments made by Barack Obama's wife Michelle, all of this culminating in this theme that Barack Obama is this exotic, bizarre, elitist, out of touch with mainstream American values, subversive, anti-American. And these are the themes which over and over and over and over again are used to demolish and destroy the character and personality of Democrats and progressives, going all the way back to Jimmy Carter, Walter Mondale, Michael Dukakis, and on, to the point where none of the substantive issues and the weighty crises that our country faces in every realm are really a part of our national elections. And I think Charlie Gibson and George Stephanopoulos, though a bit more extreme and really more transparent, I would say, in just how vapid they are, we're really doing what the establishment media does pretty much without exception in terms of how it covers our political culture.
George Stephanopoulos, the former Clinton aide, President Clinton, said he had asked fair, tough questions, the kind of questions that would be asked later. What is your response to that, Glenn Greenwald?
This is the justification that reporters use repeatedly whenever they focus on insipid, substance-free stories. They pretend that if it were strictly up to them, they, of course, would focus on the serious, substantive matters that the country faces because they're politically sophisticated observers. The problem, they say, is that Americans, the sort of heartland voter whom they patronizingly look down upon, is interested in these sort of personality-based, drudge-like issues, and therefore they have no choice but to report them, since these are the issues that are going to predominate in our political process. Now, leave aside the question as to whether or not journalists holding themselves out as political journalists have an obligation to focus on the more substantive matters independent of what they can do in order to generate as high ratings as possible. Even if you assume that political journalism ought to simply feed the public whatever the public wants. There's no evidence whatsoever to suggest that the American public is more interested in Barack Obama's bowling score or whether he wears a lapel pin than they are in how our political leaders are going to address the grave economic insecurities that the country faces or extricate ourselves from the debacle in Iraq that's becoming increasingly savage and brutal without any end in sight. This is a fiction, an invention on the part of political journalists to justify their never-ending coverage of trash. And in fact, there's much evidence to suggest, and you can ask any political elected official, that when they go back to their district, what they hear continuously are grave complaints from their constituents and others about just how ridiculous and inane political coverage is and how dominated it is by matters that have nothing to do with their lives and with the problems that they face. And these journalists believe that they're sort of spokespeople for the people in the heartland and speak for them and patronizingly say that they're interested in these insipid issues and that's why they're covered. The reality is there's no connection between the establishment journalistic class and the people whom they claim to represent, and the reason they cover those issues is because they, the journalists, want to cover them, not because the people want to hear them.
Now, Stephanopoulos said overall the questions were tough, fair, relevant, and appropriate, and rejected the claim by Obama supporters that the debate had been stacked against him, saying Hillary had faced sharp questioning as well. Glenn Greenwald.
Well, you can just simply look at the way that the first 50 minutes of the debate evolved. It was true that she was asked a question about her purported dishonesty and the quote-unquote scandal of her claiming that she was under sniper fire in Bosnia, and that was the type of question that Obama was subjected to as well. But what you really see happening here is throughout 2007, when it looked as though Hillary was going to be the nominee, or at least the media and the right wing assumed that that was the case, she was the target overwhelmingly of these sorts of attacks. The media discussed at length what they said was her artificial laugh, this sort of cackle that kind of masked a soulless, satanic quest for power. Underneath, they talked about whether she was showing cleavage. These kinds of personality attacks were directed at her when it looked as though she was a nominee. Now that Obama looks to be the nominee, and the media and the right assume that, he clearly is receiving the preponderance of these attacks. And as I said, it's always done in the same demonizing way to suggest that he's out of touch with mainstream America, even though he grew up as in a single home and his accomplishments are self-made, in contrast to George Bush and John McCain, and that he obviously is subversive and hates America and won't defend it the way all progressives won't. And that's the theme that clearly is being dumped on him, the way it always is whenever they identify who they think the progressive leader is.
At one point in the debate, Senator Obama voiced his frustration with the questions by the ABC moderators.
I think what's important is to make sure that we don't get so obsessed with gaffes that we lose sight of the fact that this is a defining moment in our history. We are going to be tackling some of the biggest issues that any president has dealt with in the last 40 years.
That was Senator Obama talking to the moderators. Glenn Greenwald.
Yeah, I mean, he's absolutely right about that. I mean, what's so ironic about this is that ABC melodramatically touted this debate as one that would confront grave constitutional questions. It was in the National Constitution Hall, and that was how they touted it. If you look at public opinion polls, the American public knows that there's something fundamentally wrong with our country. 8 out of 10 Americans think the country is dramatically off track. We have one of the most radical and hated administrations in modern American history that has dismantled our constitutional framework. That has brought us into extreme economic precariousness and disrepute around the world. And yet here are our leading journalists asking these type of questions as though those are the things that Americans want to hear. And what happens is whenever you point out that it is the media that is rendering our political discourse so toxic in a way that really disserves the American public, the way that Obama did, most journalists will immediately start had all across the board, Roger Simon in the Politico, Mark Amador and attacking whoever the critic is who points out the media behavior. And so you have Atlantic David Brooks in the New York Times essentially attacking Obama for being too petulant or for being too soft and incapable of withstanding the hardships of political battle, as though there's something adversarial and substantive about what it is that they're doing rather than trashy and petty. And again, you saw there's a column from David Brooks this morning, who always thinks he's the spokesman for heartland American values, who says that the reason why things like John Kerry's windsurfing tights and John Edwards' haircut and Barack Obama's bowling score are relevant is because that's what the American people care about. And Barack Obama, who spent the last 15 months going around the country and speaking to the American people, knows that that's not the case. Everyone knows that that's not the case. But when you point out the corruption of the journalist class, of course, you then immediately become the target of attack by the pack mentality in which journalists operate.